come public editor. Margaret ha una lunga esperienza nel giornalismo mainstream, è stata direttore della Buffalo News. Come diceva lei ieri in un panel sulle donne nei media, a molte prime volte da donna in posti di responsabilità nei media americani. È stata appunto il primo direttore del Buffalo News e poi il primo public editor donna del New York Times. È stato membro del Pulitzer Prize Board dal 2011, giurato per 4 volte, presidente della sezione documentari del board che assegna il premio Pulitzer, eletta 2 volte direttore dell'American Society of News Editors e insegna Audience and Engagement alla Columbia School of Journalism. Con lei quindi discuteremo di questo ruolo del public editor che forse qui in Italia è poco conosciuto. Noi l'abbiamo chiamato il garante dei lettori e ci sono state anche delle brevi esperienze di cui magari parleremo più tardi. Gli ombudsman, come sono chiamati internazionalmente, sono quei trade union fra i lettori e le redazioni che hanno la responsabilità e l'onere di raccogliere le opinioni, spesso le proteste, i suggerimenti, insomma tutta la voce della platea dei lettori di un media e trasferirla alla redazione e anche interloquire sempre di più con i lettori. E in questo quindi l'esperienza di Margaret è importante perché proprio le cose di cui discutiamo ormai da anni qui al festival, ogni anno, quindi il vorticoso cambiamento del giornalismo, del nostro lavoro, con un sempre maggiore coinvolgimento dei lettori nel lavoro, ma anche con un cambiamento delle forme del giornalismo che ci costringe a rimettere in discussione anche alcuni assunti dati un pochino per scontati della professione, e trova in queste figure probabilmente proprio il punto di caduta più interessante, più forse anche a volte un po' sconvolgente per loro. Magari di questo Margaret ci parlerà. E come aveva accennato, gli ombudsman sono ovunque in media in tutto il mondo. Esiste un'associazione che si chiama Organization for News Ombudsmen, che è un'organizzazione internazionale di cui fanno parte circa 80 garanti dei lettori in tutto il mondo, dal Brasile al Perù, al Messico, al Kenya, ce ne sono in Europa, in Spagna, ovviamente in Gran Bretagna. La maggior parte sono nell'America del Nord, in giornali degli Stati Uniti, del Canada, negli Stati Uniti sono circa una ventina, in Italia non esistono. Ci sono stati dei tentativi brevi, molto brevi, negli anni 80, uno al Messaggero, cito qui una bella ricerca di una collega, Federica Cherubini, che forse è qui in sala, che ha fatto una ricerca proprio sugli ombudsman e sul perché in Italia non abbiamo mai avuto fortuna con questo tipo di figura editoriale, che ricordo nel caso del New York Times, ma in quasi tutti i casi è una figura esterna alla redazione, cioè vengono assunti con un contratto ben preciso, un contratto a scadenza, e devono essere proprio neutrali rispetto alla redazione, proprio perché svolgono questo ruolo di garante, di mediatore, e è meglio che non siano troppo coinvolti. Noi avevamo appunto una breve esperienza al Messaggero con un giurista, Giuseppe Branca, e poi a Repubblica con Piero Ottone e con Gianni Corbi. E in un'intervista appunto a Federica Cherubini per questo studio, Ottone spiegava perché secondo lui in Italia non può attecchire questa forma questa figura professionale. Lui diceva per 3 motivi sostanzialmente: perché il pubblico non è abituato a fidarsi del fatto che i torti fatti dai giornalisti, gli errori, possano essere corretti, e quindi in partenza parte, diciamo, diffidente rispetto alla possibilità che una figura intermedia possa avere un qualche valore, un qualche successo. Il secondo motivo è che lui finiva per poi per stare costantemente nell'ufficio legale, perché quasi tutte le richieste che riceveva riguardavano problemi giuridici legati al lavoro del giornalista. E il terzo problema, che forse è quello un po' più grave, con cui forse ci stiamo ancora confrontando, è quello che lui chiamava la fratellanza aziendale, cioè la tendenza fra i giornalisti, cane non morde cane, no? La tendenza a non intralciarsi troppo, e quindi questa possibilità di una figura neutrale che possa garantire e far sentire i lettori sicuri di essere ascoltati veniva un pochino meno. Io adesso mi taccio, lascio la parola a Margaret, e dopo il suo discorso ci sarà spazio ovviamente per le domande del pubblico. Prego.
This is on. Hello. Thank you very much for that introduction, which I assume was wonderful, although I really didn't understand a word of it. I caught a few key words. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here with you in this beautiful place. My colleague at the New York Times, Aaron Pilhofer, is here, and he urged me to come to this festival, and I'm so glad that I did. I'm really amazed at what a wonderful gathering it is. Perugia is absolutely beautiful. It's my first visit here, and I must tell you that I absolutely love the joyful spirit I've observed at this gathering. I even love the idea of pairing the words journalism and festival. It sounds like so much fun, and usually I feel that journalism has had a very gloomy feeling over the past number of years, so just the idea of pairing the journalism and festival seems delightful to me. A student I met in California recently described this kind of event as a journo geek out, which does sound a little nerdy, but what it means is that we get a chance to get together, share ideas, become inspired, and figure out the future. I hope I can contribute to that today. Like some of you, perhaps many of you, I've known since I was a teenager, when I was the editor of my high school newspaper, what I wanted to do. And believe me, that makes us the lucky ones. I've never regretted my choice, which honestly never seemed like much of a choice to me at all. It seemed more like my destiny, or at least the only thing I could figure out that would make me happy and keep me interested day after day. And it has. Over the years, journalism has given me the chance to interview Mother Teresa, to get President Bill Clinton really mad at me, to write stories with datelines from Calcutta, Caracas, and Kathmandu. I specialized in the hard C sound. Become the first woman to be the chief editor of my hometown newspaper in Buffalo, New York, and while there, to supervise that paper's coverage of the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks, and to start its first investigative team. After about a dozen years of doing that job, I noticed a column in the Washington Post that said that the public editor of the New York Times was leaving the job. My children were getting older, my son was in law school, and my daughter was in college in New York City. In fact, I'm very happy to say that she's here with me today. So I applied for that position, and a few months later, I moved to New York City. It was a very big change from a career of being first a reporter and a columnist, later the top editor, to being the ombudswoman. It was great to get back to writing for a living, and thrilling to see my work in the Times. But the nature of the work, which involves dealing with issues of journalism ethics and integrity, fielding reader complaints, critiquing the paper, and sometimes pointing out how my colleagues could have done something better, is endlessly challenging and often stressful. Purely on the personal front, I've had to learn a few things too, one of which is that while in life, and especially as a journalist, it's very hard to please everyone all the time. As the public editor of the New York Times, it is impossible to please anyone, ever. It has been both exhilarating and uncomfortable. Overall, it's been a great lesson from the universe in simply doing your best and letting go of what the consequences might be. But there are incredible benefits. Perhaps most importantly, I've had a front row seat at the changing role of journalism in the digital age, and a chance to study that and then to comment on it daily in my blog, which is called the Public Editor's Journal, and in print in a column in the Times Sunday Review section. I also do so on Twitter. My handle is @SullyView, and that is a place where I've met many of you already. From that vantage point, it seems pretty obvious to me that some trends are emerging. We're starting to figure it out. And while I can't draw you a map, I hope that I can give you some stars to steer by. So I want to do two things in talking to you today. First, to describe the beginnings of some consensus on where journalism stands right now and where we're going. Second, to provide you with some absolute certainties amidst all the uncertainty, some enduring ideas that you can take to the bank. After I share these thoughts with you, I would like very much to take your questions and comments so that we have less a lecture and more a conversation. I'm sure that I have as much to learn from you as the other way around. So let me plunge in. First, what we know now. About 4 years ago, I read something that changed my outlook. It was a blog post by Clay Shirky, a professor at New York University, called Newspapers and Thinking the Unthinkable. At that time, I was the editor of the Buffalo News, which had been enormously profitable for decades. It is owned by Warren Buffett, who is, as you know, a world-famous investor. I had romantic notions at that time still about the sound of the printing presses and the smell of printer's ink, not to mention the steadiness of my paycheck and my ability to pay college tuition bills, and the well-being of the dozens and dozens of talented young people I had hired over the years as reporters, photographers, designers, and editors, not to mention the role of a newspaper-based free press in our nation's democracy. So I had no particular interest in thinking the unthinkable about my chosen profession. But I read this important essay in which Professor Shirky made the case that journalism right now is going through a change so monumental that we can't even see what's happening around us. He compares it to what happened after the invention of the printing press around 1500. It is, in a word, chaotic. And because we're in the midst of it, no one can say where we're going. But one place we're not going is back. The old model, if left unchanged, can't be saved. So it's like Bob Dylan wrote in a famous 1960s folk anthem, "Your old road is rapidly aging. Please get out of the new one if you can't lend a hand." I decided not to get out, but to try to lend a hand. And soon afterwards, I stopped being part of the old guard, hanging on tight with my eyes closed as tight as they would go. I joined Twitter and started a blog in Buffalo and began to have online chats with readers and to put my newsroom's resources into the direction of new media. Not long after that, the fact that I was at least somewhat conversant with all of these things was a factor in my being hired by the Times. So yes, that revelation changed my life, and its principles stay with me. That we don't know, and we have to experiment, and most things will fail, and some will succeed beyond our wildest dreams. But even in the few years since my conversion, which is a very short time in the overall scheme of this revolution we're living in, some new forms have started to take shape. It's not just a sea of uncertainty out there as far as the eye can see now. Some islands of consensus are starting to come to the surface. Here are the ones I am seeing. First, serious readers, at least sometimes, will pay for serious news. One of the best examples of that is the building in Midtown Manhattan where I go to work every day, the New York Times, where revenue from consumers actually surpassed advertising revenue a year or so ago. There are now 800,000 paying customers, digital customers. That flips on its head the old model of advertising revenue leading the way. It means that people are willingly shelling out significant dollars for a digital subscription because they really value what they're getting. It's notable that the Times got this wrong a few times before they got it right, and that it's no guarantee of future success. But for now, it's definitely working. Secondly, digital news is not just another platform. People who say that they are platform agnostic, if they're still saying that, I think have been proven to be wrong. We can't really be platform agnostic. We have to play to the strengths of the platforms that we're using. It's a whole new way of gathering and publishing information. When you see someone like Ezra Klein leaving the Washington Post to form or join Vox Media, you begin to understand that. So too, places like BuzzFeed, Vice, Vice News, Verge, Pando Daily, Business Insider, The Intercept, and many more. Many of these places will make it, eventually, on advertising revenue because they don't have the huge infrastructure costs like printing presses and trucks, big offices, and many layered staffs. These nimble new ventures are as different from newspapers as streaming House of Cards onto your iPad is from a family trip to the neighborhood movie house. And they will need talented young people with entrepreneurial spirit and technical skills to help them move to the next level. And there will be many new ones too, many that we can't even conceive of now, but maybe are being cooked up in someone's dorm room right now, or who knows, maybe even tonight in the wee hours at the Brufani Palace. Thirdly, data-driven journalism continues to be a huge trend and continues to emerge, and we have not yet figured out exactly what it's going to be. Just in the past few months, the emergence of efforts such as Nate Silver's 538, Ezra Klein's new venture, and The Upshot, a new venture at the Times, are showing us part of what is to be. We all need to be fully up to speed on what is happening in this realm. And yes, I know that for word-loving journalists, this is not always our strong suit, but it's more important than ever. Also emerging, the strength of single-subject news sites, like the education-oriented Chalkbeat, or the environmentally focused Inside Climate News. I'm sure there are many examples in your countries as well, and many more in the United States. Also, we're seeing big money philanthropists become a new source of funding for journalism. One of the first examples was ProPublica, which has done such important investigative work. Now we have First Look, where Pierre Omidyar is financing a new journalistic home for journalists who challenge the status quo, like Glenn Greenwald and Jeremy Scahill. And even more recently, the Marshall Project, where the former Times editor, Bill Keller, will focus on criminal justice. And meanwhile, of course, Jeff Bezos, the Amazon billionaire, has bought the Washington Post. I think it's a great use of some enormous personal wealth, and it's wonderful to see it gaining strength. Meanwhile, Twitter is so closely interwoven with news now that it's hard to believe that it's only 8 or so years old. As I told a group of student journalists lately, just about every hiring editor in the world is on Twitter, so it goes without saying that every journalist should be too, and not simply to announce what club they are going to tonight. It will be interesting to see if any platform comes along to truly challenge Twitter as a place to find that first draft of history, especially with breaking news. And now for my part 2, some absolute certainties that you can take to the bank. A little earlier, I talked about some romantic notions I had about newspapers that I've had to loosen up on, or at least update. Those are mostly superficial things, like the smell of ink and the roar of the presses. But there are some traditional journalistic values that I hold so dear that I'll never toss them out. They deserve to be held on to just as tight as we can. One is integrity. Simply put, as a journalist, you are not for sale, not for a free lunch or inside access to powerful people or a line on a future book contract. Your work serves the public. It is about truth-seeking and truth-telling. And your work is your work, not borrowed from or copied from others without credit. We all benefit from the information flowing all around us, but we can't pretend it's ours when it's not. Here's a pretty good way to avoid getting accused of plagiarism. Always give credit where due. Use attribution in words, in hyperlinks, or however it's appropriate, and do it unfailingly. Don't cut corners. If you want your name on it, do the work. Another is remembering that the press is not supposed to be cozy with power. We're supposed to be a check on power. Sometimes that means being adversarial, to dig out what's true when people don't want us to state it clearly, and to let the chips fall where they may, whether that means you lose access to the insiders or, in the case of a New York Times reporter I very much admire, James Risen, the risk of going to jail to protect a confidential source despite pressure from the government. This past year, with its astonishing news leaks from Edward Snowden, have put a bright spotlight on the adversarial relationship between government and press. And even in America, where we are blessed with the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which protects freedom of the press, the federal government's increasing desire to shoot the messenger, that is, to prosecute whistleblowers and threaten journalists, is one way we know how much it matters and how it simply can't be lost. That goes for watchdog news on the local and state level, too. I'm not sure how it is here, but in the United States, the decline of local newsrooms is a big and ongoing worry in this new media world. Experienced reporters who can do the tough and painstaking work of holding government and business accountable are irreplaceable, but the newsrooms that employ them are shrinking. Some of the new reporting ventures are succeeding on the local level. As citizens, we desperately need them to. And since this is the biggest reason that local newspapers, and this is the biggest reason that local newspapers need to figure out their balance sheet problems fast, watchdog news or accountability journalism is the most important work we do, and it can't be lost as we make this huge shift. It's true that, as one writer recently said about journalists, we work in tech now, but we can't forget why we got into journalism to begin with. Another certainty is the need to get it right. Fast is good, but right is better. We need the strongest possible commitment to accuracy and its close cousin, fairness. Yes, we're all in the biggest rush in the world to get the news out, and we have the ability to do so like never before, but we'll wreck it all if we don't make as sure as we can that it's verifiably true. In America, after the Connecticut school shootings in 2012, many in the press published the name of the wrong gunman early on in the reporting. And after the Boston Marathon bombing last year, a suspect was reported in custody when there was no suspect in custody. These are just two recent instances in which news organizations learned that lesson in an ugly way one more time. A reader of the New York Times wrote to me after the school shootings and said she had always believed that if I read it in the New York Times, I know it's true. But at that moment, her belief in that truth had been shaken. Once it's gone, it's very hard to earn it back. That's the bond of trust we need to keep with the public. It's never been more important than it is now in the rush of unverified information coming from all directions. New organizations like the Dublin-based Storyful can play an important role there in verifying information. So does old-fashioned double-checking and smart, experienced editing. Transparency with readers is an important part of this. We can say what we know and what we don't know at a particular time. We can also be quick to admit it when we know something is wrong or when we get something wrong. For many of the difficult ethical challenges that arise every day in journalism, transparency is often the answer. We believe in shining a bright light on the lives and works of those we cover. We're not always so eager to shine that light on ourselves or our own news organizations. But being clear and honest with our audiences about our mistakes, about our possible conflicts of interest, about what we know and don't know at a particular moment is one of the most important things we can do. So there you have it. integrity, transparency, challenging the powerful, getting it right. No matter what the technological changes, these qualities and practices are never going to go out of style. The new landscape, however it may look eventually, needs journalists who are many things. They must be adaptable, have an entrepreneurial spirit, they must be determined and doggedly persistent, and I would even use the word driven. Perhaps most important of all, amidst all the new technology and tools, we can't lose sight of the core values that attracted so many of us to journalism to begin with. A deep sense of compassion for society's underdogs, and a desire, sometimes fueled by righteous indignation, to make the world a better place by shining a light on what's wrong. So that is what I've learned, and please know that I'm continuing to learn every day. The pace of change sometimes makes me feel like I'm struggling to keep up, but I try to remember that these days, being a journalist shares at least one quality with being a shark. If you're not moving forward, it's over. And collectively, our mission is too important, and we're having too much fun to let that happen. So it's a real privilege to be with you here today at this remarkable time in journalism history. Thanks for listening, and I'd love to take your questions or comments. Thank you.
Grazie mille per questa panoramica veramente insomma, illuminante di dove siamo arrivati e di dove insomma, ci avventuriamo. E prima di darvi la parola, veramente volevo fare soltanto un paio di domande io a Margaret, perché mi incuriosiscono due aspetti del suo lavoro, anche alla luce di quello che ci ha raccontato adesso. Da una parte le sfide sembrano così monumentali che trasferirle in una redazione, per quanto si tratti di una redazione sicuramente privilegiata nel panorama internazionale. Ricordo che Emily Bell, parlando del futuro dei media, disse: non tenete conto del New York Times perché fa lega a parte. È un esempio insomma che ha tante risorse, una grande reputazione, però comunque come viene recepito, come vengono recepiti gli stimoli che tu trasferisci in redazione, qual è il rapporto con i giornalisti, e poi naturalmente ti chiederò del rapporto invece con i lettori.
Well, they're afraid to tell me, so I don't know. No, that's not true. I think that the New York Times staff understands the role of the public editor, which is about 10 years old at the Times. As some of you know, or may know, the role of public editor at the Times arose out of, as one of the correctives to a scandal that occurred at the Times, which was the reporter Jason Blair and his fabrications and his plagiarism. And so the Times decided to take a number of steps to prevent this ever from happening again. And so one of the steps was to have the role of an ombudsman or public editor, so that readers or sources or people who'd been interviewed would have someone to go to outside the hierarchy of the paper. So I think that I've found that most of the journalists at the Times understand that role. They appreciate it. They might not appreciate every single thing I say, but in the overall, the aggregate, I have found everyone to be very professional, welcoming to me personally, and supportive. So I have had some disagreements with people, certainly, and I know that there have been times when an individual hasn't been very happy with me, but I think overall and in the aggregate, there is a sense that this is a good kind of role to have and that they're happy to have it.
Mi pare dalla dimensione degli argomenti che hai trattato, che forse la tua posizione offre anche una grande opportunità alla redazione per capire, sei un po' il radar di quello che c'è fuori dalla redazione, anche hai la possibilità di percepire le cose che interessano ai lettori, quindi anche magari di orientare il coverage del giornale. In questo pensi che il ruolo del public editor stia anche un pochino cambiando, cioè è anche un ruolo di interfaccia con le esigenze, che tipo di giornalismo si desidera, quali sono gli argomenti che si vuole sentire coperti?
I think that the role of an ombudsman or a public editor has always had to involved listening to the reader, but I think that we're hearing from the readers in different forms now. I mean, people who have a problem with a story are likely to tweet at me as well as to send an email the next day. So sometimes it can be very, very instantaneous. You know, I hope and I do think that sort of putting a spotlight on the readers' concerns and giving them a place where their voice is heard is a very positive thing. So I do think that with the technology changing, there's an opportunity to hear more regularly and, you know, maybe not just in a column once every other week or something like that, but on a daily and ongoing basis from what people are saying.
Leggevo adesso brevemente nel tuo blog, dicevi proprio che ci sono magari delle tematiche che sono un pochino sottorappresentate, come quella della povertà nelle aree metropolitane, o l'ambiente, che tu hai anche avuto in questo un pochino il ruolo di trasferire queste esigenze. Ci sono poi delle questioni anche abbastanza delicate che magari ti sei trovata ad affrontare, che sono anche relative ai cambiamenti di cui parlavi adesso. Per esempio, quando la nuova edizione digitale del New York Times ha introdotto i native advertising, c'è stata una reazione da parte dei lettori e tu ti sei trovata per esempio a dover spiegare, o comunque insomma a fare da tramite, spiegare perché esisteva questa forma di pubblicità sul sito, che può risultare un po' disturbante. O anche altri esempi, mi viene in mente il tweet di Scott usato come pubblicità, anche quello è stato trattato da te sul blog, no? Il critico cinematografico del New York Times aveva fatto un tweet di apprezzamento per un certo film e il suo tweet è stato preso, estrapolato dalla compagnia pubblicitaria che rappresenta la casa di produzione di questo film, e la pubblicità è finita sul New York Times senza l'autorizzazione del giornalista, e con sua grande sorpresa, e lì c'è stato anche quindi un problema di comunicazione con l'ufficio pubblicitario del New York Times. Quindi qui si parla anche di tramite i social media, di problematiche che vengono fuori anche a livello manageriale nei giornali, insomma, quindi anche questioni molto delicate. E quindi magari se puoi fare qualche esempio in questo senso.
So just to address some of the examples that you brought up, I have written about, and one that I think is really important and has been critical. The Times, at about a year ago, I'm not sure of the timing, decided to no longer publish its environmental blog, which was called the Green Blog, and it also decided to dismantle its team of reporters who were working on environmental issues. Now, to some extent, this can be seen as simply a different way of doing it. You don't have to have a team working on something. But from the outside, it became public, not through me, but it did become public, and there were a number of groups who felt like this showed less commitment to a very important issue by the Times. And so one way that I tried to address that was by saying, well, okay, maybe they're right. Maybe the commitment to climate change coverage will be just as strong without this blog and without this team, but let's take a look at it. And so sometime later, I think it was close to a year later, I went back and sort of looked at the coverage and saw how it had changed. And there actually had been significantly less coverage. I don't think it was less good, but less volume of climate change. And so, but at the same time, there, I think, had been a recognition that this had happened, and there was a very important hire that had been made of a reporter who was an expert on climate change, and some other moves were, an editor had been assigned to a climate change or an environment group. So I think there were some moves that were already being made to remedy that. But the examples that you give of explaining this practice called native advertising, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but perhaps some are not. And so native advertising, the shorthand for that is advertising that looks like editorial content. And is this intended to fool the reader? Well, no, you can never get anyone to say that. But it's intended to draw readers into the advertising because, in part because it looks like editorial content. So I did write about that. The Times has actually done it very well in that it's labeling the native advertising very carefully, and so you'll see the words paid post. But in this instance, I don't think that I was criticizing, but maybe just saying, here's something to watch.
Abbiamo circa 20 minuti, un po' più, quindi cominciamo con le domande. C'è un microfono in sala, ce n'è una qui davanti.
Hi, I'm Paola Bonomo. You spoke about some of the ways that the New York Times is special in terms of revenue model and so on, but you didn't speak about ownership, and I think this is very important because you've been lucky to have the Sulzberger family controlling the newspaper for hundreds of years, what it feels like. A lot of other countries have papers and often televisions that are owned by people whose primary interests and whose money has been made in construction, aerospace and defense, telecoms, retail, cement, banking, you name it. And you have a minority shareholder who's one of these guys. But what advice would you have for journalists who are not as lucky as those at the New York Times in preserving their editorial independence?
Well, you make a great point that the ownership of a newspaper or media organization is hugely important. Just to give one other interesting example, I think, of this, so the two newspapers in the United States that were prominent newspapers that were owned for a very long time by families were the New York Times with the Sulzberger Ox family and the Washington Post with the Graham family. Catherine Graham, who was always one of the people I admired the most, and her son Donald Graham. And interestingly, the Grahams sold the paper recently to Jeff Bezos with his, huge, deep pockets, I think in part because they felt that this ownership, although it wouldn't be a family ownership, would be very good for the paper ultimately, that they needed that kind of financial support. So I don't think that family ownership necessarily is the crucial thing, but I do know that having a good owner is extremely important. I mean, I wish I could offer advice for people who don't have that, but the truth is that you have to do the best journalism you can given your circumstances. And unfortunately, I think what the biggest result of that lack of commitment is to not realize that the newsrooms are so crucial to the financial well-being of these institutions. So it's really, the journalism is what powers the business in media organizations, but there's not always a clear understanding of that. I mean, I don't have the answer to that. I wish I did, but I I really do agree with you that having family ownership and committed ownership is extremely important.
Hi. So as a young journalist, I'm wondering if you have any advice about where to look for learning about ethics and learning about integrity, because a lot of us, I think, now come up not through small papers where you might have daily contact with reporters or editors who have strong ethics at the core, and I'm wondering where we should look. And I, for example, am thinking about going to graduate school because I think that might be one way to get exposure to that.
Well, I do think that having some training in, some actual journalistic training in the values and ethics can be very worthwhile. I mean, I don't think that going to journalism school is an absolute necessity. I know a lot of terrific journalists who never took a journalism course in their life, but it can help, and I think that it can give you that basis. There are books that are particularly good. There are two gentlemen who've written a couple of books together, Bill Kovach and Tom Rosenstiel. I'm blanking at the moment on the title of their books, but so Kovach, Bill Kovach, and Tom Rosenstiel, I think are really good resources. I mean, I think you probably have to look to books like that actually lay this kind of thing out. The Society of Professional Journalists in the United States has very good guidelines, I think, and they're certainly worth knowing about and reading. I mean, I don't always agree with everything they say, but I think it's a hugely important subject, and it's great to hear that you're thinking about it.
Hi, Margaret. Thanks for your insights. It's been fantastic. One question, you talked about the way in which complaints are now coming direct to journalists, to you in particular as the public editor. I'm wondering what the impact of that has been on you and also on the journalists. I mean, the old processes we used to enjoy involved a lot of layers of protection. So can you enlighten us on that?
Well, one effect that it's had on me is that I feel like I'm on duty all of the time. It's really hard to walk away or be off the grid, and that can be very exhausting. I mean, there have definitely been times when I've found out from Twitter what I will be writing about the next day because there's just such a huge uproar about something. I mean, there's also a tendency to want to overreact, I think, to what's there. I've found that there are some subjects that, I mean, for example, Middle East politics and Middle East news is one in which, there's a lot of very vocal complaining being done on Twitter. I don't mean to say that it's not valid. It may or may not be valid. But if I were to respond to everything that's coming up on certain subjects, I would only be thinking about that and only writing about that. I think it is tough on, for me, it's part of my job, but I think it's tough on journalists in general to be critiqued in the moment on Twitter, but I also think it can be extremely helpful. I mean, it's a way that we find out very quickly if there's a mistake in our story, a factual mistake, and then it can be corrected, and hopefully it's corrected and we actually make note of it, not just sort of, walk on by. Which also happens. So, it's kind of cuts both ways. It's a little bit double-edged, I would say.
Ti volevo chiedere, tornando a uno dei punti che hai toccato nel discorso, la verifica è uno dei grossi temi che abbiamo trattato qui a Perugia quest'anno, perché il diluvio di informazioni è tale ed è a disposizione di tutti, non solo dei giornalisti, quindi un po' il ruolo dei giornali sta cominciando a diventare quello di essere più credibili che veloci, no? Come giustamente dicevi. Quindi questo può essere anche però un'opportunità di lavoro esterno alle redazioni, la l'esperienza di Storyful è lì a dimostrarlo, ma anche forse un'indicazione di come dobbiamo spostare le risorse all'interno delle redazioni, cioè creare delle squadre o comunque un mindset diverso fra i giornalisti e contemporaneamente renderli insomma anche più alfabetizzati nell'uso dei social media. Pensi che questa sia anche una tendenza interna alle redazioni o che si andrà anche con l'utilizzo di servizi esterni?
Well, verification has become a huge question because it is so easy to get news out there, and there are certainly proponents of the idea that we want to get it out as fast as we can and correct it as we go along. I think that's fine in some ways for some media organizations, but I also feel strongly that for leading news organizations, it is better to take a little longer and to verify before we, be as sure as we can be before we publish, because it can be very dangerous to have facts, supposed facts out there that aren't correct. I mean, some of this is, as I mentioned in my prepared remarks, it's as basic as having trusted sources. When we can have trusted and named sources, it's also very helpful. If we have a police source, for example, if we can get the person to go on the record, or if we can go to the official source, at least if it turns out to be wrong, it's not really our speculation at that point. It's coming from the Boston Police Department or whatever it may be. But as I say, there are organizations such as Storyful now, which is using essentially user-generated verification on the scene to verify videos. As we find out there are more and more people who are reporting the same kind of thing, we can use that kind of crowdsourcing to make as sure as possible that something is correct. But there's no question that the speed at which we're working now has a downside, and we have to counter it as much as we can with verification.
Hi, Margaret. You've been unusual as a public editor or ombudsman in the sense that you've written about business models and business issues much more than anybody has ever done. I'm curious about, from your vantage point, how do you see that playing out in the New York Times newsroom? Is there more collaboration between news and the business side, especially the product side? And how is that going? And would you, again, from your point of view, should there be more of it, less of it, a different way of doing it?
So the question of the wall coming down, really, between the traditional wall between the business side and the journalism side is certainly something that is happening throughout our industry. It's definitely happening at the New York Times as well, where there is very close collaboration now between the business side and the reporters and editors. One place that we've seen that happening is in terms of video, where video has become a huge push at the Times, and a few months ago, it became, something of a notable event that the person in charge of video had a dual reporting role, reporting both to a high person on the business side and to Jill Abramson, the editor of the paper. I mean, I think that can work. I don't think that's intrinsically terrible or we need to be afraid of it. But we don't want the business side to be dictating journalism. So I think it's something to watch carefully. And I think that because of that connection now between the business side and the journalism side, as public editor, I think I would be remiss if I weren't paying attention to what's going on the business side, because it's sort of all become so intertwined. So I hope to keep doing that.
Domande? davanti.
You touched upon the issue of Middle East politics and how controversial it is and how it raises a lot of criticisms on Twitter, I guess, from both sides. In your opinion, how does the New York Times journalism coverage of Israel-Palestine match up to the standards that you want to set for the story, and what do you think could be improved in the coverage of that story?
So on Middle East politics and coverage, you know, I hope in the next few months to really bear down on that and to do a full and fairly thorough look at it. What I've done so far is to really respond to individual complaints about, for example, an individual story or headline or a paragraph in a story that may not be the most balanced. It's an area in which both sides of the conflict actually constantly accuse the New York Times of being biased. And I'm not of the school that says, oh, well, if both sides are accusing you of bias, you must be doing it right. I don't actually think that's true. And I'm not really able to tell you in definitive terms, you know, to give the coverage a grade. I will tell you that I think the Times is very committed to covering Middle East politics fairly, and that I think it generally does so, but I don't think it's without flaw. And in fact, you know, I guess that's one of the things that I'd say is a fairly big takeaway from the Times in general is that, you know, like everyone else who admires the New York Times, I find it to be excellent in so many ways, but being excellent doesn't translate into being perfect. So it's kind of a constant effort to improve.
You talked before about the New York Times canceling the blog about environment, and this uproar arrived also in Italy because, well, I am an environment journalist and I heard of that. And in Italy, only La Repubblica has a journalist entirely devoted to environment since its foundation. Now are probably a couple of journalists, not the other newspapers, not the other big newspapers. Would you suggest newspaper to have people devoted to those issues that are so relevant today, or not?
Thank you very much. Yes, I mean, I think that it's one of the most important things that we can possibly be covering right now. I mean, I would urge every news organization to have a reporter or a team of reporters covering this. I can't really think of too many other subjects that are going to affect our world more than the environment. And because it is kind of an unseen thing, you know, we don't see the results necessarily of climate change every day, it's very difficult to keep it at the top of our minds unless it's brought to our attention through the media. So I think there's a huge responsibility to cover the changing climate and to do it with expertise. I mean, I don't think you can really just throw a general assignment reporter at it every once in a while and expect that to have very good results. So yes, I think it's a hugely important subject, and it would be right at the top of my list for things that I think journalists in general could be doing better with.
Matthew.
Margaret, some journalists, I think, don't see it as part of their job. I'm over here. Don't see it as part of their job to engage with readers, whether it's on Twitter or Facebook or in comments on their stories. Do you encourage them to do that? And if so, how do you do that?
Thanks. You know, I'm not really in a position to, I'm not within the newsroom structure. I don't have the ability to, you know, kind of tell reporters, hey, you ought to be doing this. But I do believe in it very much personally. I also like it. You know, I like to know, I've always felt like I wanted to be engaged with the readership and to know what people are thinking and to respond. It's very exhausting to respond to it. It's very difficult. Some reporters are better at it than others. There are a couple of Times reporters right now who have made a specialty of writing stories that are based on reader comments, you know, taking the comments and going deeper into them and coming up with stories, and I think that's great. Some people are better at it than others. I mean, I think there are some reporters who just don't really work that way, and I don't know if you can force it on people, but we are definitely in an age of engaging with our audiences, and so the more we can do it, the better, for sure.
Thanks.
Siamo verso la fine, io prenderei ancora forse una domanda prima di fare concludere a Margaret. Chi vuole dare? Anybody?
Hi. Thank you for your stimulating lecture. And New York Times recently invited the former BBC president as a CEO, right? And I'd like to know what's going on inside the New York Times. For example, in organizational, cultural conflicts, or some kind of synergetical effects of innovation, or because BBC is obviously known as a front runner in innovation of news distribution and broadcasting. I'm really interested in the interaction or communication of these cultures. So could you explain further?
So the person you're talking about is Mark Thompson, who was the Director General of the BBC and who came to the New York Times, it's now maybe about a year and a half ago, as the CEO. And I think that one of the motivations for looking to him and to the BBC as the source of the person who would head the business, really not so much the journalism, but the business side of things, was a major push that the Times is doing to become a truly global news organization. So I believe that that was a strength that Mark Thompson brought, was this sort of this globalization, and that has certainly been a very strong message that he's given to the business side and to the journalists at the Times, is to, you know, and one piece of that was that the International Herald Tribune has now become rebranded as the International New York Times, and that certainly comes out of that whole effort. One interesting piece of this internationalization is the difficulties that the New York Times has had in covering China. The Times has done some really excellent journalism in China, and unfortunately the result of that is that the Chinese government has shut down the Times's web presence in China. And so, you know, I certainly admire the fact that they didn't pull their punches, and from everything I know, Mark Thompson, who certainly would have understood that there could be a downside to these tough China stories, has not been anything except supportive of them. So it seems as though those things they're not exactly in line with each other, but the choice has been made to continue to do the good journalism.
Quindi adesso concludiamo l'incontro. Vorrei chiedere a Margaret di fare un wrap-up della situazione e dirci quali sono le sfide più imminenti che vede nel futuro della professione, anche immediato, diciamo, e le opportunità, perché tanti ragazzi che si affacciano vorrebbero capire se c'è spazio e quale.
Well,
Thank you very much, and thanks very much for this great opportunity and for all of your questions. It's been fantastic. I very much appreciate it. Well, I think the challenges are that, as I said in my talk, we don't really know. We're in the midst of this incredible change in terms of the entire world of journalism going digital, and the old business forms are falling away, and we really don't know where it's all headed. So from my point of view, the biggest challenge is to hang on to the values that really make us what we are, and not to lose them in the sort of the transition to the new world, which, I mean, I'm actually very encouraged by the numbers of new outlets there, new startups, new branches of old media, the way a number of legacy news organizations have kind of pulled themselves and their staffs kicking and screaming into the new world. That's all very encouraging. And I think for young journalists, there's a lot of opportunity out there. So I think it's pretty good. It's a pretty good time to be entering journalism. It's a very unpredictable time. I don't think that you will go to work for an organization like I did as a summer intern and end up being there for a couple of decades. That doesn't happen anymore.
Grazie mille Margaret, grazie a voi.